Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 60th episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. And on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the terms BAME, essentially to BAME or not to BAME, and the ways in which people may self-identify and how language needs to change. And I decided to talk about this as this has become a topic many people want to engage with and talk about in my online training sessions on race and race equality. So to start with, for anyone listening, I'd like to ask you question number 1, when you first became cognizant of your race. Secondly, I want to ask you how comfortable you feel talking about race. Chances are, if you're from a white majority background and you're in the UK and listening in the UK, you may not feel very comfortable. And you may have become cognizant of your race in a vastly different way to the way in which communities of colour, black people or global majority communities have. So why do we need to care about this and why do we need to talk about language? Well, in order to have consistent, ongoing and vital conversations about race, essentially systemic injustices and hierarchies, because of course race in and of itself is a phenotype. However, it's the way in which people have been divided and treated over 600 plus years that creates this concept of race. But we all need to talk about this without fear that we're going to get it totally wrong, and because that's holding us back by using that sometimes as an excuse. I also think it's really clear which words are linked to race hate speech, and I don't need to spell them out, and we know which words we absolutely don't use. But I also realise that language is fluid and we won't always get it right, or terms that we're used to might not be appropriate anymore. So let's explore some terms. So what about the following? Black with a capital B, brown with a capital B, Asian, African Caribbean, mixed race, dual heritage, person of colour, coloured, global majority, non-white, and BAME. What do you think? Which terms would you absolutely never use? Which terms would you use? And which terms do you really not know? So firstly, if we start with black with a capital B, this is a term that I know many black activists used. It was very widely used in the 60s, 70s and 80s, not just around how people self-identified, but also the wider black movement in terms of creating racial equality. And then the term brown. So this is another interesting one. I might refer to myself as brown in personal and private contexts, but I don't do it in a workplace or if I'm working with people. Why? Because again, I just don't feel comfortable. However, I have lots of colleagues and particularly know people who are younger than me or from a younger generation who would use this term. So that's interesting. I'm far more likely to use Asian in a work context. However, Asian is incredibly broad. So really I should, and I have been doing this more so, referring to myself as South Asian, because of course there is a distinction with Southeast Asian, Far East Asian, and British Southeast Asian. And then African Caribbean. Again, I would say this is absolutely up to an individual as to how they define if they want that term to be used. And then what about mixed race and dual heritage? Well, dual heritage tends to be used more in school and educational contexts, although I know many people who refer to themselves as mixed race. And if that's what people self-identify as, I would absolutely use that term. I also know that people feel that if dual heritage is used in place of mixed race, it can feel as you're not acknowledging someone's combined racial heritage. So again, I would say that's up to the individual. What about person of colour? You might also have heard of BIPOC, which is Black and Indigenous Person of Colour. Now, of course, in the UK, Indigenous communities don't really have the same context or meaning that they do as they do in North America, including First Nations in Canada and the original American peoples. You will have heard me earlier in this podcast episode saying communities of colour, and I will use that phrase. However, I know many black activists with a capital B that cannot stand this term because it relates to the other term I mentioned, or can be closely associated with the term coloured, which absolutely you wouldn't use in the UK or the US due to its links with segregation. However, this term is still used very much in South Africa, as far as I'm aware, and I have friends and family members who use this term in a non-racist way, but to describe people who are of mixed race and dual heritage. But I don't feel very comfortable using that term. And then we have non-white. Now, non-white, I would say you would not use it to describe someone who is from a community of colour, but you might see it written down when people are trying to distinguish between white and non-white communities if it's for healthcare outcomes. It's not ideal, but it is done. And then, of course, BAME, so Black Minority Ethnic or Black and Asian Minority Ethnic. Now, what really irks me about this term is the ME, the minority ethnic. What does that actually mean? And earlier on, I also mentioned global majority, and this is a term that was created by Professor Gus John, which refers to the fact that many people from communities of colour, from Black backgrounds, are actually the global majority. So he encourages us to use this term, and actually I do find that very helpful. So you might be thinking, oh, this is a minefield, what do I do? I think one of the things is to say you won't get it right all the time, but actually to frame your language, particularly if you're not from a global majority of community of colour, but to say, these are the terms we use in our workplace, BAME, for example. What term would you like me to use, or what term do you feel is better? And by doing that, someone can tell you, and then you can have a conversation on those terms. I also wanted to mention an event I attended, an online event on the 4th of September, organised by Ink Arts, and it was called #BAMEover. And it was all about how communities of colour want to be referred to and how BAME needed to be essentially over. And what I've done in the show notes is shared a link to the statement. So they've created a statement for the UK around language. And they start, BAME over, our terms of reference. We do not want to be grouped into a meaningless collective term or reduced to acronyms. We are African diaspora people. We are South East and Southeast Asian diaspora people. And we are ethnically diverse. We are people who experience racism. Use these terms in any order you choose, just don't call us BAME. And they also share some rules of engagement. So firstly, that language is evolving, deal with it. The terms we've agreed today may change in the future. Times change, come with us. And I think you will have seen that from the example I shared with some of the other terms. 2, collective terminology is necessary. Acronyms are not. Nobody wants to be reduced to an acronym, especially an acronym that is inaccurate. 3, we reject the term BAME. The term unhelpfully blends ethnicity, geography, nationality, and in doing so erases our identity and reduces us to another. 4, we reject minority. We are the global majority, and we reject ethnic. This terminology is centred on you seeing us as different. 5thly, call us by our name, be specific, and understand the terms you use. 6, we're people first, not a colour, not a continent. And the statement goes on. So if you do want to read, do read the rest. There are more points, and I think it's a really useful document. I think I just wanted to share a few highlights from the event that really resonated with me. That one of the speakers talked about being asked, where you're from, and the fact that that was incredibly reductionist and trying to reduce your human experience, that naming is problematic. However, there has been potentially an increase in Southeast Asian activism due to, if you listen to last week's episode on race hate crime, due to the sad, tragic race hate crimes that have been experienced by Southeast Asian communities. That identities are multi-layered and interracial solidarity is absolutely crucial. That using the term BAME links to erasure. And that BAME doesn't reflect the whole plethora of countries, cultures, ethnicities and identities and makes people invisible. And it denies the existence, especially in arts and culture. The other conversation was also about sign language. So sign language and signing terms for people of different races. There's also a debate in the deaf community about this and how this needs to adapt. That there is anti-blackness in communities who do not identify in being black, and this is really important to keep talking about it. But that oppression is collective and individual, and that could be different. So collectively, people may not feel that they've been as marginalised or treated as badly as other communities, but within that, there's going to be plurality in the individual experience. There's a difference between how we identify, personally, again, individually, and also politically around disadvantaged. And the point I mentioned around the impact of stats on health, education, and financial outcomes. And that acronyms that are used for us as a group of communities of colour are not by us. And it's created a system that enables white majority communities to dictate and to tell us how we should define ourselves. So an incredibly rich and important discussion. And even though there might not be one term, and lots of workplaces and organisations are still using BAME, and it depends on the context around that, but you've got to keep talking about it and having these discussions. It's also not easy. It's also not a one and done, and I totally hear that. And will there ever be a term that suits absolutely everyone? There might not be, but it's thinking about that and having the language and also having the quote unquote bravery to have these discussions. So in essence, there's a lot of terminology around to BAME or not to BAME. And I'm at the point where I think, let's not BAME anymore. It doesn't work. And I think the event I attended really helped me to understand more around the way in which it's so it's reductive language. But we need to keep talking about this in order to have these constructive conversations about race in the workplace. That you won't always get it right, and that's okay. So we know what's absolutely wrong, so we don't use those words. But to also just be honest and say, this is the term I'm used to using. How does this term fit with you? How would you like to have this conversation? And to keep talking about it. It is not a case of one and done. Keep reading about experience of others. Remember the collective versus the individual. And it's really important to make that distinction. To have a look at the BAME Over statement that they've published and the links in the show notes. And I've also linked to some speakers that spoke at the event who I think are absolutely fantastic and people you might want to follow on social media. And so I will leave you to BAME or not to BAME. That really is the question. And I hope you found this episode useful. And don't forget, you can always connect with me, tweet me, message me on LinkedIn and let me know what your thoughts are. So until next time, I'll see you very shortly where we'll be talking about more mental health and inclusion.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.